Hello, and welcome to another HSRC Connect. In a rapidly changing society with AI and technology, the relevance of the university has been called into question. And relevance here is the key. And by that I mean not only how universities respond to society's needs, but also in the fit or match of universities to respond to those needs. Relevance here includes accessibility, participation, teaching and learning, but also how universities collaborate with different sectors of society and also how they serve communities. And on that note, I'd like to introduce you to our panel today with the co-authors of a forthcoming book titled Rupture and Innovation in the African University, Debate, Thought Leadership and Practice. And on that note, I'd like to introduce you to my panel today. I have Professor Thierry Loescher, who is a strategic lead in the HSRC's Equitable Education and Economies Division. Welcome.
Thank you.
We have Professor Klein Sudin, who is a former CEO of our very own HSRC and a former Deputy Vice Chancellor of the University of Cape Town, and now serving as an Emeritus Professor in African Studies and Education. Welcome, Professor.
Welcome.
We have Krish Chetty, who is a Senior Research Manager also in our Equitable Education and Economies Division here at the HSRC, and who has specific expertise in digital transformation, digital inclusion, and knowledge management. Welcome, Krish.
Thank you.
And then we have Dr. Angelique Wilskut, who is a Research Director in our Equitable Education and Economies Division as well. Welcome, Angelique.
Thank you.
And then joining us online today, we have Vuyiswa Matembo, who is also a Senior Research Manager in the Equitable Education and Economies Division at the HSRC, and also the Project Manager of the Imprint of Education project. Welcome, Vuyiswa.
Thank you.
I'd like to talk today about this forthcoming book. All of you are co-authors in this forthcoming book called Rupture and Innovation in the African University, Debate and Practice and Thought Leadership. And what you talk about a lot is reimagining the African University. So I'd like to find out, and for all our viewers online, what is this book about and why now?
Thank you so much, Nicole, for this question. So the Imprint of Education project is a very large project that as the HSRC we have in partnership with the MasterCard Foundation, which is studying the Scholars Program. It does tracer studies of the alumni of the Scholars Program. Where do they up with their transitions into livelihoods, but also how they experienced higher education in Africa. And as part of this, the question has always arisen, what are the best practices? What are the good practices in African higher education? And in order, like you introduced, to make African higher education much more relevant to societal needs and also be able to absorb the vast number of youth in Africa that seek higher education, we have been doing studies with thought leaders on African higher education. Over 40 thought leaders in African higher education we spoke to, and out of that came this book. The basic big question that we've been asking is basically what are the ruptures, like COVID-19, like the advancing technologies, digitization, and so on. You know, how have those ruptures impacted on the African higher education system, on the African university? And what are those promising practices that we can now already observe that have been brought to light and have been developed in response to those ruptures? And so we've been talking to those thought leaders about that. And from that comes really this book, a book that shows how these big changes in conditions of knowledge and so forth have impacted on the ways universities in Africa function, their operations, and what we can learn from that, what can be maybe mainstreamed from that.
Okay, thank you. So one of the themes in the book is about reimagining the African university. So how do you define what is the African university and why does it need to be reimagined now?
Okay, so let me answer that question. So of course we're using the term African university here in a very generic kind of way. But the reality is that there isn't an African university. And we don't want to fall into the trap of homogenizing the continent as a single space. But we use that term to essentially talk about the need to think about this institution called the university. So the first point I think to be making here is that while this landscape is incredibly diverse, incredibly fractured in all kinds of ways, there are commonalities to the historical background to what these institutions are all about. I'm talking about contemporary institutions. A big thing that we make in this book is to emphasize that institutions have been on the continent for almost now two and a half thousand years. And that's quite an extraordinary thing for people to get their heads around. Following this trope, this idea that the African continent was empty, that there was nothing cognitively going on. But the contemporary African university has this modern history, and this modern history is essentially that of colonialism. And what colonialism does is to come to impose a particular set of patterns, rituals, customs, formations, habits on these universities, which we are attempting to understand in terms of how this imposition plays itself out. It plays itself out, of course, in the form of these first institutional establishments, but then there are ruptures, and the book is about these ruptures, and the ruptures are an absolutely wonderful thing to get one's head around. Rupture is a really important thing to understand, and we can talk about that, Nicole, thing to understand about how these institutions take form, take shape, move in different directions, and begin to innovate. But I'm assuming we'll get there. Yes?
Definitely. I do have some questions about that. But I'm glad that there's two very important things that you touched on. The first one is the historical context and how we need to understand the historical history and context of institutions to be able to understand it now. And I know that your book provides a historical background of this institutionalization. The second thing that is really important that you touched on was this homogenization. And that actually leads me to my next question. I want to understand how you included a diversity of voices in this conversation of the African university.
Thanks, Nicole. Yes, I think it is primarily our main material to work with is really the thought leaders that we have been interviewing, and we've been really crossing the continent and beyond to find those who have been or still are now involved in innovative practices and know about them and are themselves deeply involved in debates around, for example, how African epistemologies, or what Mudimbe and Paul Zoleza call the African libraries, knowledge libraries can be brought back into the fore, moving away from the dominance of Western and Northern epistemologies and recovering the African libraries, for example. So we've been talking to people that will be very well known to those who are interested in higher education in Africa. People like Paul Selez, as I mentioned, Tade Aina. We've been talking to Achille Mbembe, to Sabelo Ndlovugacheni, to just mention a few of them, to Ritumetsi Mabukela, to Tebogo Moja, to Kathleen Odora Hoppers, all of which are thought leaders known in the African higher education context. People like Patrick Aoua or Frederick Swaneker, who have done amazing things with institutions on this continent and who've really tried out new ways, new institutional types, new ways of offering higher education on the continent. And so that's the main material, and that's really where the big learning comes from that is in this book. It is grounded not in the should be and could be, but in what is, and how that relates to the thought leadership of these people that we've interviewed, and to debates around the decolonization of knowledge, of institutional cultures, the massification and expansion of higher education on the continent, the technological innovations that they are and how they are rupturing indeed and questioning the way universities, not just in Africa, but globally operate, right? So
this book is very much strongly empirically and theoretically grounded.
Absolutely, Nicole. It's a very much empirically grounded book that mainly draws on this on exploring and exposing these innovative practices that are in reality existing, that one sees right now, and what they mean and what the potential inherent in those practices are to really change and move on from the inheritance that many of these institutions, the colonial inheritance that many of these institutions still manifest, and the ongoing their ongoing links to funders from overseas and so on, who to some extent dictate or certainly influence very strongly how they continue to operate, what their curriculum and their research agendas are.
But thought leaders are not the only voices that you've included, right?
We've also included the voices of alumni, for example, from the MasterCard Scholars Program, those who typically come with academically very promising backgrounds, but often from socio-economic disadvantaged backgrounds, and enter, like so many, as the first in their generation, in their families, universities, and then encounter this space, as alienating as it is, move through it, and we talk to them for 5 years on an ongoing basis using various kinds of very innovative social science methodologies to try and get them to think about what has been their experience and in what way has this experience been empowering, almost emancipating, and in what ways has it been have they had a sense of alienation and marginalization, and also from that, then moving from that, so what can we learn from that? What is the African University right now promising and offering in good ways, and what really can be improved? What really the African University of the future can be reimagined as?
And I think that's very important to know, because this book has relevance not only to scholars in higher education or thought leaders, but also to students who find themselves as first generation students going to university for the first time. I actually want to come back to this concept of rupture. And Crane, you said we are going to come back to it. So my understanding of rupture is a disruption, right? Like disruptive innovation or anything of that nature. But I want you to clarify what you mean by rupture, and if you could possibly provide an example of a rupture and maybe the kinds of practices that it changed or a new institution that emerged from that rupture.
So the reality is that we have ruptures every single day. Every single moment, in some ways, is a rupture. So a rupture is a break, is a moment in which you have to, in some ways, change direction. What the factors are behind that are always going to be important, because those ruptures can be good ruptures, they can have really important and productive kinds of outcomes, they can also be bad, they can be in some ways antisocial. So we're wanting to, in thinking about this book, talk about a rupture. So colonialism is a rupture. What colonialism does is come to break a particular cultural trajectory that is in motion. And that particular rupture is a terrible rupture, because it in some ways invalidates, it erases, it comes to institute this idea that what had gone before was of absolutely no value. So that's a bad rupture. When you come to the post-colonial, you have a turn, a shift of moment. And that shift of moment, in many instances on the continent during the 1960s, is immensely interesting. And you have some of the most interesting developments that arise in a whole range of fields on the continent coming out of that moment. So what we do in the book, we do a little bit of the recovery of that history. Now that history is well known. The book is not new. What we are doing now is not new in that portion of the book, in recovering that history. But what we are doing in relation to it is to describe it in new terms.
Okay.
And that's an important thing to say. We're saying that here's a moment of incredible potential, and what was that moment all about? And then we have the neo-colonial, the moment from around about the 1980s, when austerity, the IMF and the World Bank charge into the continent and effectively persuade the authorities, these post-colonial authorities, to disinvest from higher education. And that impact we are still having to deal with. I mean, what it does is essentially shift resources from higher education into other forms of expenditure, and it has the effect of introducing into those institutions new forms of having to finance and capitalize themselves, and a lot of very destructive practices come to be instituted in the institutions, which still continue today. And those funding regimes are still in place. But then we come to the advent of, if you like, tech, this moment of the student uprisings around the continent, and another rupture happens. And that rupture is one which we are essentially in. We're in that rupture, the process of that rupture now. And what it contains are the ingredients which we are trying to put forward in this book as providing the leadership of this continent with the opportunity to think of a new theory of change. Because what it effectively is is foregrounding, is emphasizing our institutions taking back a sense of their own agency. And that's the big thing, a sense of their own agency. It's very much like the Cuban moment of the 1970s, after the Cuban Revolution, when the Cubans are forced to do things by themselves. It's not quite the same here, but we are beginning to see people doing things by themselves. And this is where the thought leaders are really useful. They point us to these many instances where people are beginning to do things autonomously, with their resources at hand, but critically also with the intellectual affordances which require them to innovate. And you see those innovations in a whole range of different kinds of expressions. This is what the empirical value of this book is. It's attempting to construct a narrative which is fundamentally a rupture. We're trying to rupture the narrative. And that narrative is not one of failure, Afro-pessimism, despondency, inevitable collapse, but it is about possibility. And we want to take this possibility that is there and give it a language, give it a discourse. We're trying to theorize it. And in the end, in the conclusion, we're trying to say to people that when you talk about planning, managing your institutions, don't go and look at the textbooks of if you like, the northern mainstream only. Think also about yourselves and what it is that you yourselves have been doing in this last period of the last 10 years. Look at yourselves. Draw on your own libraries. Think about how those libraries might begin to inform a future practice. So this is what this rupture, this idea of rupture is all about. It's an attempt here to think about moving us into a space in which we can actually begin to take more and more control over what those environments are all about.
On the topic of rupture and African libraries, I'd like to ask Angelique, in terms of indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, and cultural knowledge, is there space for that kind of knowledge in the Reimagined African University?
Thanks for that question, Nicole. A loaded question, but also not. Of course, there is space, and there must be space, and it must actually be foregrounded. But I think one of the things that we wanted to make quite clear in the book around this notion of indigenous knowledge, decolonization, is that we need to engage very critically with what that means. And so when we're talking about indigenous knowledge, we cannot engage with it as a moment in time that it's static and assume that it happened at a particular point in time, and that indigenous knowledge is not reflective of the knowledge that we have currently. And so in the book, we are quite careful to not engage with these discourses around decolonization, what is traditional knowledge, what is indigenous, and what is endogenous, as a static set of notions. We urge readers to critically engage with what that would mean for them. For academics and for institutions, we similarly urge them to engage with what that would mean within their context and the relevance that they want to impart within their communities. And so it's not a sort of uniform approach around decolonization means inherently that you need to go back and look at what indigenous knowledges are and try and incorporate it into your curriculum. It needs to be born out of your context and born out of your realities. I think the final point I'd like to make around the question of whether there's space for cultural knowledge and traditional knowledge is that, you know, one of our thought leaders, Tari Aina, makes a few very notable points, but one of them is just this acknowledgement around this pluriverse of knowledges as well, that there is not only one kind of knowledge that exists. And so as we move forward and we try and reimagine what the future African university looks like, we have to be engaged in different ways of knowing and acknowledge and value all of these different ways of knowing, and not try to subvert one above the other or one below the other. Yeah, I think I think there's quite a lot we can say about this topic, and it comes up in different chapters of the book. But I think the notion around engaging critically around this topic, acknowledgement of pluriversity around this, and also I think one of the striking comments that Tari made for me around this notion of traditional indigenous knowledge and decolonization is his assertion that indigenous and endogenous knowledge can be used as a way in which to think about decolonizing the curriculum. And so I think I'm not going to go much further, but I think those are some of the thoughts that I'd like to leave in regards to that discussion. I think maybe if anybody else wants to add, if I haven't said
I actually have a follow-up question
Yeah.
on the curriculum. What would you say are some of the current issues with the undergraduate curriculum?
Okay, I'll take a first stab and I'll ask Crane to help me if I don't touch on all of the points. I'll reflect on what we did in the book around curriculum to start answering the question around what we need to think about when we think about an appropriate undergraduate curriculum in the African University of the future. In the book, we are quite careful to trace like the genealogy of the development of different disciplines in the university for us to understand why certain parameters for change in the undergraduate curriculum across different African institutions might exist. And so I think that is a useful contribution because I don't think a lot of readers might actually be aware of this background, and I think it brings to the fore the importance of this historicity in reflecting on what is required for today. So let us go back and see why things exist in the way in which they exist today, to be able to understand why certain changes are not as easy for certain institutions. So I think that's an important contribution for universities grappling with how do we engage with an appropriate undergraduate curriculum towards the future. So in the book, as I said, we trace that genealogy and we look at, I think the most important contribution of that chapter is that we then also look at innovative practices in terms of different centers or faculties across African universities that start to model the kind of institutional structures that are good practices that we can take forward in the African University of the future. What some of the main principles around these centers or innovative programs present to us is the embeddedness and rootedness in the context. And we have found that the best kind of responsiveness in terms of the curriculum, undergraduate curriculum, often tends to come from those kinds of orientations. So I think the value in the book is, as Crane and as Thierry has also mentioned, is very much around lifting out those innovative practices, innovative structural organization that allows these kinds of more appropriate curriculums in the African context to emerge.
Krish, I'd like to ask you about the rupture of technology and what kind of rupture or opportunities, or what is the impact of technology on this reimagined African university?
Yeah, thanks Nicole for the question. It's been touched on earlier in the discussion about these changes that are in play at the moment. The world is changing largely due to the advances that we are seeing in technologies. And some of the ruptures that have taken place, we've spoken about slightly. Here in South Africa, if you look back over the last decade, through the Fees Must Fall movement, it was through those protests that were occurring that we started to see here a greater reliance on technology for us to apply online learning as a workaround when the university wasn't a safe space for learning. And then through those learnings, through those experiences, when COVID hit, the South African universities then became, they were a little bit more prepared to adopt this online learning. In the rest of the continent, we saw attempts at going online, and various difficulties emerged in that space. And then just as we were starting to get to grips with what this technology change, this reliance on online learning meant, in late 2022, we started to see this ChatGPT moment. And now suddenly you have this arrival of AI, artificial intelligence, and generative AI coming to the fore. And today we're seeing new tools, with the latest model having an IQ of 120, whereas the average human has an IQ of 105. So these are the things that are happening, and technology is improving all the time. And so it's with that context, with those changes that we're starting to see, we need to come to grips with what that means and then think about how we prepare for the future. And some of our thought leaders, specifically Fred Swaneker, spent a lot of time thinking about this and changing the way that they approach their learning models. And Fred Swaneker in particular, he speaks about this era of knowledge abundance. And then what does this mean when we think about how we actually offer a new way of teaching for our students? And so he proposes a very interesting model where he talks about decentralized learning hubs. And so he thinks about the big challenges that we see with this reliance on online learning. The digital access challenge is immense, and the digital divide is ever present, and it impacts the way that we're teaching. So some benefit and some don't. So how do we overcome that divide? And so through these decentralized learning hubs, Swaneker is saying, let's place these high-tech learning facilities closer to areas where our young people live. Give them opportunities to access the technology, access all these different types of learning materials so that they can then be empowered and become the drivers of their learning. And so he also talks about student-driven learning. And so it's an interesting concept where you are thinking about what your future entails and how you should prepare yourself. And so you then use these decentralized learning hubs. You're finding the content that you need. You're thinking about the structures that your degree should take, and you then look for the material to support that. So it's a very interesting model that he's adopted. And there's great opportunities there. There's great cost savings that have emerged, and there's a lot of food for thought there for the rest of the education sector.
I actually want to move to Thierry, because you mentioned in the book, with the context of such a changing society and with AI, as you mentioned, Krish, and with technology, how do higher education institutions remain relevant to society's needs?
Thanks. I think that's an overall topic in the book, and it comes up across like all the chapters. Just to say, the basic structure of the book is we have 3 sections. There's the introductory section that really sets up the arguments that and begins to introduce the notions of rupture and the conditions of knowledge, that they change and the possibilities that arise from that, and attempt to uncover and explore innovative practices, the historical dimension of African higher education going back thousands of years, including the colonial rupture in that continuity. And then the core of the book is actually chapters that precisely look at, so now what are those practices and how do they manifest, and the debates, how do they manifest in different functions of the university. In particular, we're looking at undergraduate teaching and learning in the curriculum. We're looking at knowledge production, postgraduate studies and research. We're looking at community engagement, student support, supporting the transitions of young people into higher education, through higher education and into livelihoods, and all the changes and shifts they undergo in that period, becoming adults, and seeking academic success and transitioning to the world of work. And then the last is also about looking at the technologies. But when it comes particularly to your question now around relevance, so one of the things is the disconnect between the institution and the communities and society that surrounds. It's something that Julius Nyerere raised at the very beginning at the development of the University of Dar es Salaam, or as it was, the University of East Africa then. The need to keep the academia, the academic community and the students and the graduates connected and rooted within their communities and their society. The big danger of what is sometimes called a division between town and gown, or there are various kinds of community engagement practices in teaching and learning, in research and knowledge production, in the way the university is anchored and embedded within and contributes to the socio-economic development of its surrounding areas and beyond, right? And that thought leaders like, for example, Rajesh Tandon really reflect on that. He makes an example, Rajesh Tandon makes an example around how local agricultural practices and water management practices can inform a curriculum on hydrology, right? For example, or how we also look at the example of a university in South Africa in a wine farming area, actually having specific departments and degrees that are world class in what? In winemaking and viticulture, for example. And that is an example of an institution that could completely ignore where it's embedded in, as against one that sees what we need is to understand and support our local farming practices in this case, in a way that both our wines are world class and our university is world class, right? But it's a world class that builds from the bottom up. It is the local relevance that creates that, global attention. People look at institutions that are able to engage with local practices, with local knowledge, and then start codifying it in the way that all disciplines should emerge, and that is how epistemology is actually supposed to emerge from, not from something imported.
So just to summarize our conversation thus far, my understanding is that ruptures happen all the time. It could be in the form of technology, in the form of colonialism, but what you're trying to let emerge in the book is that ruptures can lead to innovative practices, and you're trying to highlight what those innovative practices are from the perspective of not being influenced by others' perspectives and others' discourses, but with your own agency from Africa, informing this uniquely African local and contextually relevant narrative.
And that is, I think, how we can arrive at a reimagining of the African higher education sector, or metaphorically or metonymically speaking, the African university, in all the diversity that it manifests in, precisely.
But you particularly want to highlight the agency of shaping that narrative from these different thought leaders and how that has emerged.
Well, not particularly. So it's not a particular, if you like, subtext, but it's an important thing to simply always just be keeping in mind the ways in which, and I'm going to put this quite bluntly, these spaces are racialized, right? They're racialized in very distinct kinds of ways. So the African subject is racialized in a way which produces this idea of dependence. And that's the kind of almost dominance. So you can't do anything without, if you like, you being given a hand up, or you being pointed in a direction, or you being told what, in the worst case, is in your best interests. What is in your best interests? I know what is in your best interests. And what we are talking about here, it's not in the book, but it's what in some ways impels the argument of the book here, that we are human beings. And that we as human beings have, like human beings everywhere in the world, the capacity for higher order thinking. We have the capacity to be able to think, to be able to see. And what our thought leaders are doing here is demonstrating how this is playing itself out, how this is coming into a sense of its place in the human story of our development. And it's a really important thing. So, they're not putting it in racial language, right? But they're talking about what is their entitlement to be as human beings, to be able to speak in their own voice. And to speak in your own voice is a really, really powerful thing. Where you are beginning to take charge of that space, which is where you are. And taking charge of that space in an intellectual way here now is doing a complicated thing of saying that we want it all. We want this tech. It's not just because we're black that we don't want tech. Africans, that tech is our entitlement. But we want that full repository of all of that past. And we are very open to thinking about this knowledge that comes from the north. We're open to it. We're not wanting to say that it's of absolutely no value. We use it. This is a demonstration of it right here now, but on our terms.
I'd like to hear some reflections on the alumni. So I'd like to go to Vuyiswa, who's joining us online. Tell us a bit about the MasterCard Scholars Foundation program and some of the views and experiences expressed by some of the alumni.
Thanks, Nicole. As Terry mentioned earlier, at the beginning, the book forms part of a bigger project, the Imprint of Education study, which we are conducting in partnership with the MasterCard Foundation. A component of the book entails us tracking graduates who were funded to complete their tertiary education by the MasterCard Foundation Scholars Program. So we have been talking to alumni of the Scholars Program quantitatively and qualitatively for a period of about 5 years now. And what has come through in engaging them on the future African university, plus their perceptions of what a high quality education is the fact that in relation to quality in the education they received, they see quality education in economic terms rather. So a good quality education offers one, work-ready skills. It contributes to improving their economic circumstances, but also it affords them access to certain networks. So when they talk about quality education, they just speak in economic terms. So that got them thinking, what would a future African university look like for them? And emphasis is primarily on a practical education that is forward-thinking, that is accessible to all, and that is quite inclusive. So for them, an education that gives them skills to be employers, if they so choose to be employers, but also prepares them for the world of work. So that is primarily what is coming out from the graduates involved in the study.
And are all the graduates and alumni first generation university entrants?
Mostly, I would say all of them. So the Scholars Program, when selecting scholars to fund for tertiary education, their selection criteria does include socioeconomic status, plus willingness to be of service, and academic talent as well. So most of them would be first generation graduates, but not necessarily so. But the willingness to be of service, because the focus is also on young people who are intentional about becoming ethical and transformative leaders and contribute towards the transformation of the African continent.
I actually want to get back to this topic of socio-economic disadvantaged backgrounds and the students that are coming into the university as first generation students or from socio-economically disadvantaged backgrounds. Can you reflect on some of the transition support that is available to students or problematize it?
Thanks, Nicole. I think Vuyiswa and I can answer that question in terms of the background of the students, but the transition model that we have been thinking through actually comes from the thought leadership of Professor Teboho Moja, who's a professor of student affairs and education leadership, and lives in the African diaspora, working at New York University. Her thinking here is very much about the different kinds of layers of transitions that students, young people go through. So we're talking at a personal level. For example, the transition from adolescence into adulthood, oftentimes for the students that are coming into universities is the first time to be confronted with such a complex institution. There's a lot of learning that has to go on, and also, of course, challenges precisely in terms of, for example, the socio-economic background, like how am I on my own going to make a living within this context? In some countries, in some institutions, there may be quite good financial support and funding support and quite a good support system available. In others, less so, where peer groups and friendship groups and families are much more carrying students. Then there is the institutional level of learning, of course, just to be able to navigate the faculties, the departments, the classes, the lecturers, and from what often is quite a regimented high school background into this space where one is now responsible for one's own time management and identifying learning needs and gaps and so on. And thirdly, then the big transitions as well from first from the high school into the institution, first year experience, second year, third year, out of the university again, and then into the world of work, into livelihoods and so on. So that's the big model. And with respect to each of them, they are practices that even in resource constrained contexts have been proven to be extremely successful, particularly when it comes to peer-to-peer support, when it comes to student-centered and student-driven support systems, when it comes to having those open boundaries between the campus or the institution and the community. Student entrepreneurship starts typically on or in the immediate neighborhood of campuses and so on. And all of that, all it requires to some extent is encouragement, is support, and then there's a dynamic that can develop around that. For example, Dr. Sam Fongwa, who's at Codestria now, did a fascinating study at the University of Bouera in Cameroon, where he showed how an institution gets surrounded by micro businesses, by small, micro, medium-sized businesses, and how this organic kind of economic relationship develops over decades, indeed, in this case. And so that is what intentionality, there's an intentionality that must be introduced into that, rather than looking at that in without really recognizing it, but from the institution and from the community background to actually be encouraging and intentional about those linkages, and with that actually to create a vibrancy and a supportiveness. Maybe the last point that I want to make is that what we've also found is what in South Africa we call Ubuntu, which is essentially around the recognition of each person as being part of a larger community, and this sense of that if you are hungry, I cannot be sitting around with a full stomach, for example. And that also is something that is really important, and it must be recognized. It must be recognized as part of how students support and the kinds of values that we also want to foster within this higher education spaces.
My next question goes to Angelique. I'd like you to reflect a bit on whether we're creating African or global scholars. I'd like you to kind of contrast local relevance with global competitiveness.
So I'm not going to contrast it, and I think I'm going to latch onto some of the comments that Crane had made earlier, is that we want it all. That we are not looking at it as an either or, and we are not trying in the book to say that universities must attempt to be globally relevant or locally relevant only. They have to be able to do both. I think, let me reflect just on some of the insights in the knowledge production chapter, which I think helps us in responding to this question. And so while we recognize that we need both, and that we want our relevance to emerge out of that acknowledgement and recognition of context, we know from the trends in our knowledge production, for example, that as scholars, we do not always engage in practices that lend itself to the kind of institution and knowledge production practices that the African university of the future should actually foster. When we look at the trends in knowledge production, we see that we tend to collaborate with northern international scholars, and we tend to less so collaborate with our our regional and national networks to produce knowledge. And I think similar to many other thought leaders, what we want to emphasize in the book through looking at these trends in knowledge production is to remind ourselves that it is important for us as universities and African scholars to engage in collaborative practice to write our own knowledge. That's very, very important to take into this idea of the African University of the future.
I'd like to just go around to each of the speakers and each of the guests in closing. And I'd like to start with Vuyiswa online. What for you is the significance of this book?
For me, Nicole, it's the fact that the book, rather than focusing on what is not going well within higher education on the African continent, the book highlights best practices and innovations that are working currently regarding the university as an institution, funding issues, access issues, governance issues across a range of contexts. So to me, that's one of the highlights of the book. And as such, it's not a book about what we should be doing within the higher education landscape. And this is something that Crane always emphasizes, that the book should not have been about the should be, but what is working currently. And then seeing that as a possibility for Africa to then reimagine the university. So to me, that is just what is key about the book. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you, Vuyiswa. Thierry?
Well, I want to reflect on the significance of the book in a bit of a different way, and that is that what we have been trying to do, and you can see there's a really diverse group, a big group of co-authors involved, is not to emphasize our own voice in the writing of the book and in what the book is about, but really in giving space to African higher education thought leaders. And unlike, I think, other books of this nature that will draw on, what we call those kinds of knowledge libraries as well, we actually and then use them to corroborate the argument of the authors. We actually are giving a platform specifically to those thought leaders to be able to have the space to elaborate their ideas on a particular topic quite extensively. So every single chapter of the book showcases one or two of those thought leaders in quite some depth, gives a little bit of a background about the thought leader. And then on the topic, whether it is on the impact of generative AI in the higher education space in Africa, or whether it is around new centers of knowledge production emerging that are interdisciplinary and so on, we allow the space for the thought leader to really elaborate their idea and introduce the debate and start to articulate from the ground up what their observations are, what is happening right now in some institutions. And then we build on that and we bring then in other thought leaders and other literatures in order to create a debate around this very topic. But I think that's very unique about it. And with that, it is really also an introduction into the thinking of, you know, and not necessarily into the thinking of Crane Sudin or Angelique Wolzke, but into the thinking of very important thought leaders in the African higher education space, you know. So it's in a way, it's also a reference book to say, let me read more about what this person is actually saying, you know, about, for example, student support practices or so. That's for me, I think it's very important. It's where the book makes a really important contribution that's kind of different from what one would usually expect from a social science kind of work.
Thank you. Crane, in closing, for you, what is the significance of this book?
So both Vuyiswa and Terry have said a lot, and have captured, I think, a lot of what I think collectively we've almost arrived at as a group of people. But I'd like to put what particularly Terry has now just said in these last few sentences into a little more relief here. And it's in thinking about this book I hope will be a provocation. And that's my personal agenda here in some ways, that what we're able to do with this book is to put this thing in front of people who are managing the landscape, who are involved in it in one form or another, and to think of it as a site of inquiry, right? As a site of investigation into practices that are emerging, and that provocation is essentially about getting us to, and this is why talking to Terry with this last chapter here, I'd like to be thinking of as an emergent discourse, that we are participating in producing an emergent discourse here. Now, it's not stabilized yet, this what we're putting forward, this idea of these possibilities. It's not stabilized. It can still fall over. You know, we might still see an easy reversion to what had been on the continent round about 2010, where landscapes, systems were totally dependent on foreign aid. You know, all of those possibilities are still there. But what the rupture does is give you these examples where people are themselves beginning to innovate in their laboratories, are beginning to think about, you know, approaching questions in new kinds of ways. So the provocation is, how do you sustain that momentum? How do you do that? And if we can put this book out into this domain of policymakers, thinkers, donors, to help us see how this emergent discourse can be propelled, that would be a really great thing.
And practitioners as well,
Yeah.
right? Because it speaks very much to the practice as well.
No, absolutely. So we want to say, here's an example, right? And this is why this should story I find, you know, quite irritating. A lot of African scholarship, and I'm going to be rude here, is about every single paragraph is this normative should. African universities should. I'll say, for heaven's sakes, please. For heaven's sakes. You know, tell us how to get into a new space. Don't recover this textbook stuff that you read, you know, from somewhere else. Tell us about the possibilities that, you know, we ourselves are capable of. And I think that this book, you know, if it's going to be playing a helpful role, must do that. You know, people must come back to us and say, you people are really off the charts here. You know, you've pressed wrong buttons, and our response is going to be, okay, If we press the wrong buttons, tell us what the right buttons are. Right? Give us the examples. Tell us what's going to actually emerge here in the next one and how we might make that possible. So this is a provocation.
Thank you. Krish, for you?
Well, at the risk of repeating what some of my colleagues have said, I think what really gets me here is that we've tried to study what have been the catalysts of change that have been taking place in recent memory, at least. Potentially, this book offers us that opportunity where this book itself becomes a new catalyst of change. So our thought leaders have really delved really deeply into various topics about the problems that are affecting us, and they have actual solutions that we could consider. And so let this be a provocation that can bring in new change.
Thank you. And last but not least,
It's
Angelique.
so difficult to go after all of these people. But I mean, I can only second all of the comments that have been made thus far, and I maybe want to just borrow one of Crane's words that he's used before when we started talking about how do we pull all of this together in the last chapter. So the so what. So we've shared all of the visions from the thought leaders. We've tried to distill them, not in terms of principles, but to say these are some of the tensions in terms of the visions, because it is, as everybody has said, easy to say what should be done. But that always there are some trade-offs, obviously, in terms of the context within which it needs to happen, etc., the resources that are available. And so in the last chapter, we try to draw on the visions, draw on the innovative practices and empirical practices that we were able to show in the book, and try to move towards what Crane would call an emic theory of change. And so drawing on these practices, internal practices, and not to try and look towards ways of change that derive from externally imposed schema, So I think maybe that would be the last kind of point that I wanted to leave with us, but I think it just reiterates what everybody else has been saying.
Thank you, Angelique. And I think that's the perfect point to end on. So I'd like to thank everyone for your openness, your experience, and being here today. I hope that conversation was as stimulating for you as it was for me. And wait for our next HSRC Connect.